Realism is an ever-present challenge in many mainstream and AAA games, and for the better part of the last 20 years, it has been the white whale, or the dragon, for developers to chase after. I remember games as old as the late 80s, early 90s, advertising themselves as realistic racing, realistic boat sailing, realistic spaceships, which seems kind of like a weird term there, but I digress. However, a big question though is realism, is there such a thing as too much of it in a video game? And at what point does realism hurt the accessibility or the design of a title? Now, as the thumbnail for this video demonstrates, the game that kind of brought about this discussion is Red Dead Redemption 2, aka Cowboy Western Simulator 2018. Now, I haven't had a chance to play it yet, but I've watched people do it, and they are trying to put everything and anything they could into this game. Snow realistically models as you press down on it with your feet. You can see the individual, as close as you can, the individual hairs or strands of hair in somebody's beard or partial beard. It's not only you have to go hunt an animal, you have to track it, you have to kill it, you have to skin it very carefully, drag the skin back to your horse, take the horse to a trader, and then turn it in for money. It is a game that tries to be as close to a realistic environment as one can get. And this kind of focus on realism, like I said, has always been a push in the AAA market, because AAA developers have the money and the technology to throw everything they can at it. Now, in the early days of 3D, realism was kind of out the window. Anyone wants to Google early 3D games and get a little nightmare there. But over the start of the last decade, especially beginning with games like Grand Theft Auto or even arguably with Shenmue, there was this idea of trying to make games realistic. Try to tell stories beyond just, you need to save the princess. You need to defeat the big bad demon. We want, realism. We don't want just to swing a sword. We want, accurately model sword thrusts and swipes. We want to model health systems, with full recovery. We want guns to behave as they do in real life. And like I said, developers all across the board have been wanting to push realism whenever they can, because it is a great show for the technical side of a game. And obviously with titles like Red Dead Redemption, even stuff like Mass Effect, Assassin's Creed, and you name it, when these games look that amazing, it draws a lot of eyes to your game. But getting back to the point, is there a situation where realism just begins to get in the way? And the reason why we bring this up is that video games are always about abstraction. It is about showing some activity that the player is never going to do or never going to be able to do like that. I don't know about you, but I don't see myself casting fireballs or summoning skeletal minions anytime soon. Likewise, I don't think we're going to be flying spaceships and getting into dogfights in the next 3 years. So every video game, no matter what its design or implementation, has a layer of abstraction. Even when we talk about pure action games like Ninja Gaiden, Devil May Cry, God of War, you name it, there's still that level or that layer there that dictates how much damage things take. How do you heal? Kratos never gets tired after pushing down his umpteenth boulder or toppling every titan in the world. And because of that, no video game, no matter how much money is spent on it, no matter what engine they use, is 100% realistic. Because if a game is 100% realistic, then you're just literally doing that job or that task. And again, this is where things get very tricky. Because another big part of the abstraction process is playability, making your game easier for someone to digest and jump into. And we see this from some of the best studios. Developers like Nintendo with the Mario series, Firaxis, with Civilization and XCOM. XCOM being a really good example. Both XCOM and XCOM 2 are heavily abstracted games. They are built more on board game rules than on real time. And part of the reason they did that was to make it easier for someone to digest. It is far easier for someone to figure out XCOM Enemy Unknown than it is to play the original XCOM Enemy Unknown. And like we've said, playability is king, and is the common thing that can trip up a lot of first-time and indie developers when you're trying to get your game to be appealing to a greater audience. But, taking this back to realism, realism by itself is about presenting things as hard and as static as they would in real life. Again, when in real life, two broadswords don't magically do more damage to each other. Likewise, 27 pistols that are all the same are going to behave the exact same way. Now, while that is certainly more realistic, for a game, it does present things being boring after a while. And again, trying to make a game appealing can sometimes get in the way of making it realistic. And I have an example that I want to talk about, but it's unfortunately not one that I have game footage of. But before we do that, just a quick word to our Patreon supporters. And now a quick shout out to the supporters over on patreon.com/GWBycer. Later, that came out, I believe it was last year. With Alone Dark, and like other survival games before it, it also pushed itself onto the side of realism over playability. This is a game where you need to monitor the durability of your clothing, how many calories you're taking in, whether your body temperature is warm enough, and so on and so forth. Another game that's a really good example of the push of realism that unfortunately I don't have footage of is Red Orchestra 2 by Tripwire Interactive. In that game, this was a realistic first-person shooter set during World War II, where players had to deal with basically having very limited defensive options, and that battles came down to split seconds of aiming and getting that shot off. With that said, though, as we talked about in the first part, when we look at realism in video games and that push forward, it always comes at the expense of playability. And it's a very interesting push and pull for certain games and certain designs. For me personally, I prefer playability over realism, because I'd rather have something that is easier to play or more accessible than something that tries to bog down in the minutiae of realistic details. As a good example of this, one thing that always drives me crazy are games that require you to stop what you're doing and pick up all manner of doodads and items that are left on the ground after a battle or killing an enemy, even if the player has unlimited inventory space. Now, of course, the obvious point is that it's realistic to have to pick the stuff up, but from a playability standpoint, just hitting a button or just auto-picking up would keep the game working at a decent pace. And trying to figure out that balance between realism and playability can be a tough call. Again, the survival genre definitely focuses on realism, but I think it does come at the cost of playability. This is why, for instance, I became such a fan of Subnautica compared to The Long Dark, Rust, and the other examples. Subnautica keeps things very unrealistic in terms of using science fiction to create food, crafting, and stuff like that, and it's more focused on the exploration after the first few hours of play, wherein a game like The Long Dark always has that push of realism and survival. You have to keep working at it, or you will eventually fail. And again, it's a very tricky point to have. I talked about this the last time we brought up realism in video games, but something like with Sid Meier's Pirates, where Sid Meier talked about not using scurvy in the game because they couldn't figure out a way to make it an interesting game mechanic or system for the player to deal with. And again, this goes back to my previous point, that if I had to choose between a game that's very realistic or one that is very playable, I want to go for playability at all walks. But I'm curious what everybody thinks who's watching this. Do you prefer games that err on the side of realism, or do you prefer things that may not be that realistic, but make up for it by having a high amount of playability? And as a second question, at what point do you think, is there a top end of realism? how much realism should a game go for before it seems to just be getting bogged down by it. I remember we played a game on the Grabback stream. It was like a first-person shooter techno thriller where the whole game was just, I guess the only way to describe it would be gun porn. That you couldn't just shoot and reload your gun. No, you have to open the magazine, put bullets in, put the magazine back together, stick it back in the gun, cock the gun, pull back the revolver, and all other gun-related terms that you can think of. And while there was certainly nothing else like it, it got very tiresome fast to play. But with that said, thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we some of the art and science of games. And if you'd like to suggest a topic for a future piece, please let me know. But otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel linked down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.